Welcome to Elder of Zion TV. Today we're going to be looking at a video that came out a few days ago from Vox.com. It's called The Israel Palestine Conflict, A Brief, Simple History. We're only going to look at the first couple of minutes of this video because it would take a long time to describe all of the distortions and lies in this entire 10-minute video. This should be enough. Let's start.
One of the biggest myths about the Israel-Palestine conflict is that it's been going on for centuries, all about ancient religious hatreds.
Let's talk about this a little bit. Nobody says that the Israel-Palestine conflict has gone on for centuries because there was no such thing as Israel as in the modern sense, and there was no such thing as Palestine. So it already starts off with a straw man. But to say that religion is not an important part of the conflict, if you look at the history of the Middle East and you see what has been going on between Christians, Muslims, and Jews since 2,000 years ago, you can't say that religion isn't a very important part of this conflict.
In fact, while religion is involved, conflict's mostly about two groups of people who claim the same land, and it really only goes back about a century to the early 1900s.
This is certainly not true. It's inaccurate for a number of reasons. Even if you talk about more modern Zionism, the modern version of Zionism started in the end of towards the end of the 19th century, not in 1900. But even before that, Arab antipathy towards Jews and Muslim antipathy towards Jews was endemic. Nobody's going to say that things were as bad as it always was in Europe, but the conflict started way before 1900, as long as you frame it correctly. This video is trying very hard to frame things to start in 1900 because when they do it that way, they make it look like Jews really didn't exist in any serious numbers or that they weren't an important part of the Middle East before 1900 and that most of the Jews that came from Europe. That's really the subtext of this video.
Around then, the region along the eastern Mediterranean we now call Israel-Palestine, been under Ottoman rule for centuries. Was religiously diverse, including mostly Muslims and Christians, also a small number of Jews who lived generally in peace.
Again, generally in peace compared to Jews that were under pogroms in Europe, but there were plenty of incidents, and it goes a little bit beyond that. The only reason there was relative peace is because the Jews were forced to live as second-class citizens, and they had no choice in the matter. As long as they didn't try to be uppity, as long as they didn't try to act as equals, the Muslims were okay with them. This is not exactly what peace is supposed to look like. It is not exactly what equal rights is supposed to look like.
It was changing in two important ways. First, more people in the region were developing a sense of being not just ethnic Arabs, but Palestinians, a distinct national identity. This is as much of a lie as you can come up with. There was no Palestinian identity at all. There was an Arab identity. The countries were divided up, as the video says a little bit later, into Jordan and Syria and Lebanon, etc. The Arabs themselves consider themselves all just to be Arabs. There is, a tiny Palestinian national movement in the 19-teens. It did not amount to much whatsoever. Even the major leaders that later became known as Palestinian leaders wanted Palestine to be part of southern Syria as a much greater empire of, essentially an Arab empire. To say that there was Palestinian identity and there was Palestinian nationalism in, starting around the year 1900 is nothing short of a lie. At the same time, not so far away in Europe, more Jews were joining a movement called Zionism, which said that Judaism was not just a religion, but a nationality, one that deserved a nation of its own.
Two problems with this. Actually, there's a lot of problems with this. One of them is that, again, Vox is trying to make it sound like, the Zionists were nothing but Europeans. Secondly, they're saying that Zionism is trying to say that Judaism is not only a religion. It's not true. Everybody at the time, if you look at the books from the 19th century or from the 18th century, everybody, Christians, everybody understood, and Jews of course as well, that Judaism, the Jews are more than just a religion, that they are a nation, the Hebrew nation. Just Google it in Google books from the 19th century. Everybody understood that Jews were a nation, and everybody understood where the Jewish nation is supposed to be in, of course, the ancient land of Israel and Judah. This, the way that they're framing it over here is, and not only that, they're making it sound like Arab nationalism predated Zionism, which is because they mentioned this fake Palestinian nationalism first. This is just as deceptive as it gets.
And after centuries of persecution, many believed a Jewish state was their only way of safety and saw their historic homeland in the Middle East as their best hope for establishing it. In the first decades of the 20th century, tens of thousands of European Jews moved there.
There were always Jews moving to Israel. It's not only a 19th century and 20th century phenomenon. Jews always have been trying to move back to Israel. Israel has always been central to Jewish life, central to Jewish philosophy, central to the prayers. This, of course, is not anything that Vox wants to talk about because they don't want to make it look like Jews have such ancient ties to the land. But that is essential. The framing of that is what's essential.
After World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and British and French empires carved up the Middle East, the British taking control of a region it called the British Mandate for Palestine.
First of all, I'm not sure why the map isn't showing the actual part of the British Mandate of Palestine. Secondly, the original British Mandate of Palestine included what was called Transjordan. They're not showing that over here. The video does not mention the Balfour Declaration, which is also an essential thing to understand. Britain promised Palestine to the Jews, to be a homeland for the Jews. And that was what it was meant to be. It was not meant to be divided up. It was not meant to be an Arab state. There were other Arab states, and Jordan was really meant to be the Arab state, or Transjordan as it was called at the time. Palestine was meant to be, again, Britain called it the Jewish homeland. Jews accepted that as meaning it's going to become a state. And immediately, the Jews that lived there started building what was to become a state.
At first, the British allowed Jewish immigration. But as more Jews arrived, settling into farming communities, tension between Jews and Arabs grew. Both sides committed acts of violence, and by the 1930s, the British began limiting Jewish immigration.
This is unbelievable how they're describing this over here. The Arabs attacked the Jews. There were not both Jews and Arabs doing violence. There were Arab attacks against the Jews in 1921 and 1922. There were the huge pogroms of 1929. There was a gigantic uprising against both the Jews and the British in the 1930s, starting in 1936. The Jews only started to defend themselves after years and years of these Arab attacks. The way Vox is making it sound is like, oh, both sides were fighting and both sides were doing atrocities. No, the Haganah was set up as purely a defense organization, as they're about to talk about right now. But it was over here, the way that they're describing this is ridiculous. The Arabs attacked the Jews, period.
Immigration. In response, Jewish militias formed to fight both the local Arabs and to resist British rule.
The fact that the British stopped immigration ended up being very important because later on they're going to briefly mention the Holocaust. And of course, if Britain didn't cave to Arab demands of stopping Jewish immigration, millions of Jews could have been saved. But the Arabs complained and they whined and they said, oh, we don't want these Jews over here. And the British, instead of sticking to their promise of making it a Jewish homeland, they decided, oh, these Arabs they're causing us problems. We don't want to have these sort of problems. We're going to cave to their demands. It's the exact same thing that we see today.
Then came the Holocaust, leading many more Jews to flee Europe for British Palestine and galvanizing much of the world in support of a Jewish state.
It is true that there was sympathy after the Holocaust. The world certainly didn't have sympathy for the Jews before the Holocaust because the Jews tried very hard to find a place to go. But yes, the world understood that Israel is the obvious and the clear and obvious place for Jews to live. That is, that was obvious and that was clear. That had to be done. And but they're trying to make it sound like, oh, it's only because of sympathy that there was that the Jews were trying to move there anyway. No, the Jews were building all the institutions already. Since the Balfour Declaration, all of the state institutions that essentially the Jews were working and had an effectively autonomy along themselves and were ready to be able to do to create their own state even before the Holocaust.
In 1947, as sectarian violence between Jews and Arabs there grew, the United Nations approved a plan to divide British Palestine into two separate states, one for Jews, Israel, and one for Arabs, Palestine.
Again, they were going to divide it into two states. This is true. That was the UN proposal, which was a little bit different than the similar proposal that was also done in the 1930s, the Peel Commission. The Jews accepted that one too. The Jews just wanted independence. They wanted a state. The Arabs did not want independence. They did not want to have an independent Palestinian state. As I mentioned, originally they wanted Palestine to be part of Syria. What the Arabs wanted was to get rid of the Jewish state. This is the other essential fact that is not ever told about in these histories because they try to make things sound so even-handed. The Jews had claims, the Arabs had claims. No, the Jews wanted to live, the Arabs didn't want the Jews to live. That's not exactly an equal claim. And of course, nobody said that the Arab state was going to be called Palestine. The word Palestine and Palestinian before 1948 almost invariably referred to Jews.
The city of Jerusalem, where Jews, Muslims, and Christians all have holy sites, was to become a special international zone. The plan was meant to give Jews a state, to establish Palestinian independence, and to end the sectarian violence that the British could no longer control. The Jews accepted the plan, and they declared independence as Israel. But Arabs throughout the region saw the UN plan as just more European colonialism trying to steal their land. Many of the Arab states, who had just recently won independence themselves, declared war on Israel in an effort to establish a unified Arab Palestine where all of British Palestine had been.
No, they did not want to establish an independent Palestine. They wanted to destroy the Jewish state. Jordan was not interested in creating an independent Palestine, as is obvious from the fact that they wanted to get all the land for themselves. Egypt was not interested in creating an independent Palestine. They all were going to divide it up among themselves if they would have defeated the Jews.
The new state of Israel won the war, but in the process they pushed well past their borders under the UN plan, taking the western half of Jerusalem and much of the land that was to have been part of Palestine.
The UN plan was not international law. The UN plan was a suggestion. The Jews accepted it. The Arabs did not accept it. The borders were meaningless because they had no legal validity whatsoever. The armistice lines that ended up after the war is where the Jews happened to end up, managing to survive. They had to go on the offensive because when they were with the original borders, as they tried, the Arabs there was no way. They was just being slaughtered. But now to make it sound like, oh, the Jews somehow took land that was not supposed to be theirs, the entire land was supposed to be theirs, according to the Balfour Declaration. Keep that in mind. This is, the way they're trying to make it sound is that somehow there was these land-grabbing Jews were taking over more land than what they were supposed to do.
They also expelled huge numbers of Palestinians from their homes, creating a massive refugee population whose descendants today number about 7 million.
This is an absolute lie. The vast majority of Palestinians fled out of fear of the war, just like many of them fled in the 1936 conflict as well, when there was the uprising. They said, let's get out of here, we'll go back when we can. But there were a few that were expelled, I'm not going to deny that. There were many that proactively left on their own. Most of them fled out of fear, including Mahmoud Abbas and his family, which is something that he freely admits when he's being honest. He never saw an Israeli soldier. They heard rumors, they got scared, they ran, and then they blamed the Jews for kicking them out.
At the end of the war, Israel controlled all of the territory except for Gaza, which Egypt controlled, and the West Bank, named because it's west of the Jordan River, which Jordan controlled.
Jordan didn't control it. Jordan annexed it. What's interesting about that is the Palestinians, or the so-called Palestinians that lived there, didn't call themselves Palestinians. They were happy to be under Jordanian rule. They just wanted to be under Arab rule. They did not want Israel to exist. Has nothing to do with an independent Palestinian state. Jordan took over, and they became Jordanian citizens, and none of them, from what I can tell, ever made a serious effort to say, oh, we want to have an independent Palestinian state in the West Bank. Egypt did not annex Gaza. It took it over and it created a fake Palestinian state out of it, which was essentially an excuse to make sure that Egypt could take all the Palestinians that fled to Egypt itself and put them into this big open-air prison. Yes, Egypt is what created Gaza to be an open-air Palestinian prison. Again, even then, even though there was a fake government that they called themselves the All-Palestine government, nevertheless, it was not meant to be independent. It was just meant to be under Egypt. Jordan and the other Arab states had big disagreements over what should be the plan when they divide up Palestine. And, Jordan had their own ways of looking at it. Egypt and the other Arab states were against what Jordan did. But the fact is, nobody, I mean nobody, was interested in creating an independent Palestinian state between 1948 and 1967.
This was the beginning of the decades-long Arab-Israeli conflict.
No, it wasn't. If you want to call it Arab-Israeli, yes. Since nobody called it Israel before 1948, you can say that was the beginning. But obviously it wasn't the beginning. The beginning of the conflict is Jews wanting equal rights. And the Arabs, whether they're Muslims or the Christians, did not want that to happen.
During this period, many Jews in Arab-majority countries fled or were expelled, arriving in Israel. Then something happened that transformed the conflict. In 1967, Israel and the neighboring Arab states fought another war.
That's an amazing jump from 1948 to 1967. The video says nothing about the terror attacks that happened against Jews in the meanwhile. It didn't talk about the other attacks from Arab nations against Israel, which were fairly constant. All of a sudden it's just, oh, there's a war. It didn't talk about, the Arab threats against Israel, which were, again, never ended. It didn't talk about the rise of Nasser as, again, a harbinger to a new pan-Arab nation that would be strong enough to be able to fight Israel. This video is just filled with deceptions. It's filled with lies. And most of all, it's filled with omissions that completely take away the context of how things really should be. That's the end of part one. Thank you very much.